you all so much for being here. It's been a lovely 2 days. I've heard that yesterday people also saw dolphins. So just FYI, if I see everyone looking over, I'll know why. Um, I'd like to thank our panelists for being here today. As Soraya mentioned, part of sustainability is not just about the money, right? We have to be able to sustain our leaders and our talent. This has to be a field that people want to work in and want to stay in and can live a fulfilled life by working in. So that's what today's conversation is about. It's really about work culture. It's about the workplace. We're gonna do intros by way of a little storytelling with the panelists here. So my first question is really about you all sharing your journey and how you came into the field of journalism. What were the pivotal moments that brought you here? And I'm gonna start with Tara.
Well, I have a biochemistry degree, which has helped a lot in the leadership of a newsroom. I'm not really sure. I wanted to run away and join the science circus. That's what it's called in Australia, Questicon Science Circus. And I couldn't quite break into that field. And I thought, what's an easier field to get into? And journalism. But really, I think once you have a niche or a niche, it's a lot easier to get in. And so I started writing, and I fell in love with magazine publications at first. And so I started in magazines and worked my way up to this position now. So it was really accidental.
Yeah, I'll throw it to Chabeli next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chabeli Carrazana. I don't have an awesome journalism, origin story. I was really just a very curious kid who loved writing, and my aunt worked in the advertising department at the Miami Herald, so I was always sort of around journalism a little bit, and I thought, this is the place where I maybe can take the things I love and make a difference. I really wanted to do something that was impactful with my work, and I've actually thought about this question a little bit the other way, which is how my experiences ended up shaping my journalism, because I've always been a business reporter. I was a business reporter at the Miami Herald. That was my first job. It was the dream job. And then at the Orlando Sentinel. And when I got to the 19th, I really started to realize that the way that I thought about business reporting was really shaped by my experiences. I'm an immigrant. I moved here from Cuba when I was 5. My family was very low income when we were first here. And then I had a family arrive over the years that worked as childcare workers and home health aides and construction workers and bakery clerks. My mother was a housekeeper and a school crossing guard, even though she had an engineering degree. And so those were the stories I sort of gravitated toward. It wasn't until I got to the 19th that I realized, my lived experience is informing the way that I'm approaching journalism. So I've really sort of thought about it the other way around, and that's really shaped the way that I've kind of made my way through this career.
What about you, Dean?
I had no idea I wanted to be a journalist. I mean, I grew up in New Orleans. We got the New Orleans papers. I didn't see the New York Times for the first time until I went to college. It's hard for some people here to remember this, but there was a time when there was no internet. So if you didn't get the actual paper, you couldn't get it. It was when it was time to go to college. I didn't know where I wanted to apply. I like to write. I like to read a lot. My best friend, out of the blue, decided to apply to Columbia University. And I'd never been outside of New Orleans. I'd never been on an airplane. So I applied because I thought it'd be fun to hang out with my friend. And he didn't get in. He's forgiven me. And I got in and was an English major. And just didn't know what I wanted to do. And then I was homesick the summer after my freshman year. I just missed New Orleans. I missed all my friends, most of whom had stayed in New Orleans for college. And I decided I wanted to do something. And I went to the afternoon paper in New Orleans and applied for an internship. And in those days, believe it or not, getting an internship was a piece of cake, because this is 1974, 75. Because every city had 2 or 3 newspapers. So I got an internship. I was 19 and just fell in love with it. Just thought, wow, I'm not, there are a whole room full of people who are crazy too. So, so I fell in love with it, and I tried to go back to college afterward, and my heart wasn't in it, so I never finished college. And that was, and even at that point, I thought, this is great. I'm going to be a reporter for my whole life in New Orleans at the Times-Picayune. I never thought about moving on, or so it was. I feel like everything for me was an accident.
Really?
Yeah.
I kind of relate to that. You know, mine was sort of happenstance. I know I'm the moderator, but I'm also going to answer the question. Sorry. Mine was also very much happenstance. I graduated from college, and at that time Detroit was going, through bankruptcy, and it was attracting all these people who were like, well, I can like start up a business and do this. I can do this like for really low cost. And so, I was working for a bicycle manufacturer for one of these, entrepreneurs, and he ran out of capital and he furloughed everybody. And I was like, what am I going to do with my free time? I started a blog, and the managing general manager at the public radio station was like, this is a cool blog, Michelle Zerbinovich. I think she's here. And I was like, you can hire me. I'll do this for you. So it's just so interesting. I'm going to take a copy Jim and say, how many people in the room kind of stumbled into journalism? Like, okay. And how many people were born and were like, this is it?
Wow, that's so interesting.
Okay. I think more on the former, but I think it's kind of like a mix. I think that's so interesting because this field does attract people that have a certain passion or see themselves or see a glimmer of like their identity or their purpose in this work. And that's just so important to remember. Dean, I have a question for you. So tell us about what the first, one of the early newsrooms you're in. What was the mood? What was the culture? And, I know you're working with a lot of next generation talent through the fellowship program at New York Times, and you're seeing the local newsrooms that they're able to be a part of. What's different between what the newsroom looked like now and what you see them experiencing today?
They're extraordinarily different. I mean, they had some things in common. I mean, the passion for craft. I think people in newsrooms in general have passion for craft, but they were mostly men. And the few women there were, this is the afternoon paper in New Orleans, and this is like 1976, 77, I guess. Mostly men, very few black journalists. I think it was me and 2 or 3 others. Smallish newsroom, 50 people or so, I guess. Mostly people who were in New Orleans because they wanted to be, they were LSU grads. There were a handful of people who had come from the Northeast to work in the South. But very different, very little, as we discussed yesterday. It was you would never say no to an editor. Even at the most ridiculous assignments, right? And it was an afternoon paper, which, most people here may have not had the experience with afternoon paper. Think a tabloid mentality, right? So you would never say, I once, was assigned to ride I'm afraid of heights, in a hot air balloon with the world champion hot air balloonist when he came to New Orleans, and we crashed. So you would never say to the city editor, no, man, look, I'm afraid of heights. But can you get like Chris over here to do it? So I get when I spend time in newsrooms now, that part. I mean, again, there was. I don't want to denigrate that era. There was a tremendous amount of passion, but the newsrooms of today are clearly, all of them, even big newsrooms like the New York Times, are more diverse. I think people have a language for the first time to talk about taking care of themselves. There was never, you worked 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. If something happened in your beat, you went. And it was even, frankly, a sign of weakness to put in for overtime, right? So I would argue that the current culture where people think about taking care of themselves is much healthier. But there were a lot of people who drank a lot. And now, remember, this was also a newsroom in New Orleans. So There were a lot of people who drank a lot everywhere in New Orleans, but it was a very, very, very different world than what I see when I visit newsrooms today.
Chabeli, take us into the 19th. What's that newsroom like? What is the culture? How does it compare to what you just heard?
Yeah, I mean, it's the 19th. I've worked in local newsrooms my whole career, and the 19th is different from every newsroom I've been in and heard about, both editorially and organizationally. So I'll talk about the editorial side. When I interviewed for this job that I never in my life thought I was going to get, Aaron Haynes, who some of y'all might know, said to me, "Chabeli, your background is your superpower. Use it. Let it make your stories better." And that unlocked something for me that I had never thought about, which was a little bit of what I was talking about earlier, how this newsroom was asking me to lean into my lived experience to make the work better. And so that is something that is really sort of foundational for all of the work that we do. I'm the economy reporter, which is an enormous beat that could be anything, right? But I have really started to think about, how can I take my experiences as an immigrant, as a low-income person, help me find stories that other people aren't finding, ask questions that other people aren't asking, couch things, understand sort of some of the contours of these stories that other folks don't, and really bring that to the work and hopefully make it better. And so that's something we're all encouraged to do. That's a big part of who we are at the 19th. On the other side of that, organizationally, I could maybe talk for like 10 hours about how different we are organizationally. We have 6 months of fully paid parental leave, 4 months of fully paid caregiver leave. We are a newsroom that believes in rest. We just came back from New Orleans for our week-long retreat, and that's a time when we say we're not online, we're not publishing anything. A week in December where we also do that. That's on top of all of the other time that we have off. So we really believe in that. We really believe in transparency, pay salaries. That goes on every single job opening. And then we just have a lot of input as well as reporters, and not just reporters, everybody in the newsroom, on what happens. Right now I'm part of a working group on our long-term strategic plan. We have input on who our corporate sponsors are going to be. We have input. We feel it's not just about feeling like we have that input, but actually knowing that our input is being taken into account and is sort of, all of us are part of making the 19th what it is. And that is really singular for me. It's an experience I've never had. And it really, it just makes me love the place that I work. It's just so different.
Yeah, and Tara, you sort of sit in the seat as someone who, you're a managing editor, but you're also operations director. You're wearing two hats, and you sit at the seat in which you are fully responsible for the well-being of people. And you're thinking about like policies and procedures that make a workplace inviting. What are sort of the things that you think about? And what's your newsroom look like, under your leadership?
Yeah, so a little background on our newsroom. The Appeal, we cover criminal justice and the harms of the system. We try and elevate solutions from communities as well. We've been publishing since 2018, and then in 2021, our leadership fired all the staff and closed the newsroom, and we're going to turn the website off. And we believe deeply in the community impact of our work and wanted to keep that journalism going. So we as staff co-founded a new nonprofit newsroom and negotiated to take over all of the intellectual property to keep our journalism alive, and have been doing that ever since. So unsurprisingly, the values of transparency, equity, and care are our core values now because of everything we've been through. And so it's my job to basically weave those values into the sorts of policies that the 19th has. So we use user manuals to try and enable our team to care for one another. We're really intentional about meetings. We're multi-local, so we have people across the country. So our meetings take place in the middle of the day where it's prime time for everybody and before school pickup begins. We have meeting-free week at the end of every month, which allows, particularly myself as a leader, a little bit more of that strategic time. Also allows our reporters to know that they won't have any eternal meetings, so they can really buckle down into some of their work that they want to be doing. We also have ample time off. Flexible time off is a lot like unlimited. And we also have 3 weeks of summer and winter closures as well. That provides both like the collective and individual rest, which serve like very different needs. And I found that the most, I think, impactful policy we've implemented is just flex time. And so it's not just, you know, you need to go to the doctor, you're going to take a couple of hours. We have an out of office channel, and so that is when you would drop in if you're popping out for a couple of hours. But it's also where you put in if you just want to take a day off. If you're not well, or if you just can't today, that's totally fine. And I found that removing the barrier of like logging into your HR system and entering your time off and then me having to go in and approve it, that's a waste of time, and it allows people to actually just feel more welcome to take time. And we've seen the direct impacts with our actual journalists. So one of our reporters is a single mom and has spoken really, really openly about how these policies allow her to stay not just at our newsroom, but in journalism. Her work has led to state and federal investigations and improved prison conditions. And she wouldn't be in this industry without this sort of flexibility. And we had another investigation last year on a police shooting of a teenager in Phoenix, Arizona. And his 3 friends, teenagers at the time, were charged with his murder under their felony murder laws. And our reporter spent months interviewing the loved ones of these impacted families. And that's so much weight to carry as a journalist. And you're in these interviews, you all know this, but you're trying to get the details, but she's also crying alongside these people. And that allows you to build great community, and it's just empathetic and it's kind. And that's really exhausting. And so she's spoken about how she felt so welcome and empowered after those interviews to just say, hey, I'm taking the rest of the day. And that allowed her to recuperate and then come back the next week and be just as supportive and engaged in that community without burning out. And that leads to really empathetic and strong storytelling and allows the community to be more engaged in that. And that reporting ended up, community groups led 2 coalitions. They support those families now. They've met with the DOJ. They just had an annual vigil that our reporter is at. And lawmakers earlier this year introduced legislation to try and repeal felony murder laws. And that impact in our community is because of the care-centered policies for our journalists. So it affects, like, it's about taking care of our team, and then it's about impacting the communities through that.
Can I ask a hard question?
Yes.
I think in a perfect world, like, who wouldn't, want to work in an environment like you're describing? But there are newsrooms that are like, resource strapped. They're small teams. They may not have the luxury to work a 4-day week, work week. In other cases, the news cycle, doesn't give you a day off. So do you believe that this sort of policy or this sort of workplace culture kind of works for a certain type of newsroom? And I guess I'd like you to respond. I'm curious what everyone else thinks too, but.
Yeah, I definitely think if you wanted to implement the full scope of what we do, you might want to not be the New York Times. But there's definitely elements of it. If you maybe even if you just manage a team, knowing that your reporters had a really tough interview, maybe you can't give them the day off because you do have so many stories that need to go out and you have city hall meetings. Can you not tell them, you need to go take a walk in the park? It's just reframing the thinking. And thinking at these are great policies, what can be adapted to the needs of our particular newsroom? And all of the things I mentioned are free as well. We're also resource strapped. We're only a handful of people in our newsroom. And so there are so many of these things don't cost money and can be done and piloted even in a small team before you even want to roll out to a whole newsroom.
I think people frankly would be surprised how much big newsrooms like the New York Times have changed from the sort of. I mean, you were appalled when I told you we used to smoke in the newsroom when I started, and that your ashtray lived right next to your typewriter, not computer, but typewriter. So, I do think that newsrooms have changed. I mean, whether it basic stuff, parental leave, it would have been unimaginable when I started in a newsroom that you would acknowledge that you were traumatized by covering a story. I mean, I remember running the New York Times' coverage of the Oklahoma City bombing and sitting in my hotel room watching having which pictures we would use, and including this historic picture of the firefighter carrying the baby, and like sitting in my hotel room in Oklahoma City bawling like a baby. So newsrooms have changed, but there are limitations to what a newsroom like the Times can do. I mean, which I suspect everybody would agree with. The news cycle, you can't. The news cycle is too relentless till you have to publish 7 days a week, right? You have to, if you have people who are covering the war in Afghanistan, you can't. I mean, when I visited the Kabul bureau, I mean the bureau chief, she can't bring her husband. She couldn't bring her husband. She couldn't bring her kids. There are demands of if you were a traditional news organization that, we use the example of if there was one reporter in San Diego and there was a school shooting in downtown San Diego, that one reporter is going to have to cover it, even if she's exhausted and other stuff. I don't think, though, that newsrooms should use those very powerful forces to let them go back to the days when they were just nasty to each other. I think we all do have to sort of struggle with the fact that there are these demands of certain kinds of newsrooms, but that can't be an excuse to sort of say, you have to do this, you have to do that. I mean, I told you the story of a colleague whose name I won't mention, who's older than I am, who when he got his first assignment, his foreign assignment, said yes on the spot. And he had a family. I would not let, when I would offer foreign assignments when I was the editor of the Times, I wouldn't let anybody say yes on the spot. I was like, I don't even want to hear yes on the spot. You got to go figure this out with your family and in your life. So newsrooms are different, but I think I would be lying if I said that the news doesn't dictate the relentless demands of news. I mean, if you cover the White House and the president calls a press conference, an emergency press conference, the person who covers the White House has to go. And you just have to accept that. But as I said, not use that as an excuse to say, we have a mission, screw you, and forget about your life, we don't want to hear about it, which frankly is, I think, the way newsrooms operated, when I started.
Yeah, I always wondered, I kind of think about this question, because this panel is about transforming how the story is getting told. You think about the end result, right? The end result of the news story getting done, getting up, could be significant and impactful for a community, to the external environment. Is there a right or wrong way to get to that end point? Like, even if the story and the goal of creating meaningful coverage is the result of all it, does it matter how that happens so much, or what? I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think the wrong way is to cause harm. I think we have such an enormous responsibility to our sources, first and foremost, to not cause harm. And that, we're in a time when trust in journalism is so fractured. And I think my first responsibility as a reporter is to make sure I'm not harming any of the people who are brave enough to share their story with me, to be part of this story. I've had many instances where, people are sharing things with me that they ostensibly are saying, I'm okay with you including this, but I know that this could potentially harm this person in the long run. Would it make my story stronger? Maybe, to include it, but I never do. And so I think a wrong way certainly is if we forget that these are also real people that we are writing about with real lives who we could be hurting in the process. I always think about that.
I have a question, because it's something I struggle with as an editor that's related to that. We have two great we have many obligations, but for the purposes of this discussion, we have two great obligations that we struggle to balance. How do you lead a bunch of people, a newsroom, people who are dedicated, work unbelievable hours, committed to a mission, and then how do you serve the reader too, right? Like I agree that especially for the powerless people that you don't like just screw you, I'm throwing your name in the paper. On the other hand, there's a tension. If you don't put anybody's name in the story, right? I'm sure you've had this experience too. It's that, if you don't put anybody's name in the story, nobody's going to believe the story. I don't believe that if you write about, there's a story that went up in the Times today about how the Hunter Biden case made this family think about their own awful struggles with addiction, right? Boy, that's a very revealing story to have, in a, millions of people reading. If you couldn't use their names, I don't think that would be a story you could publish. I'm sure everybody agrees. I'm not, but I guess I'm offering that tension, because that tension between, my audience, who I'm not just making a nickel off of, I'm serving them. I'm trying to help them understand the world, and my staff, who I really have to care about and do care about, and want to make sure that they have, healthy lives, but it's a hard balancing act.
Yeah, we have a lot of those discussions, particularly around naming people, particularly if they're incarcerated, they can face a lot of retribution, but also naming them in particular stories helps actually get them resources. So we told a story about one man who bit into prison food, and they wouldn't give him any dental care despite the fact he didn't have front teeth anymore for years until we wrote that story. And he was finally able to get fitted for implants and can actually eat now and is cared for. And we have other stories where we talked about, do we name this person because the city keeps letting him fall through the cracks and we're trying to get him help? And so I think it's just that constant conversation. Yeah. And we have harm minimization guidelines where it's like, these are the moments that we have really hard conversations. So one of them is information where we know it could harm somebody, particularly if like parole hearings and things, there's certain things that can come back. So it's lots of like, is this relevant to the keys? Is this like core to the story that you're telling? Or is it just like, these tend to be the sorts of details we just include by habit. And we also have a process of, if people are being harmed by a story post-publication, they can reach out to us and we'll have a discussion about other amendments. If stories of like your innocence or overcharging or something, but it's coming up in your job search, your like future employers, that's what they're seeing. We've like been able to work with people to change it maybe to their initials or something, so it's no longer coming up in Google search results. Because that journalism is still there, and we're trying to minimize that harm, and so it's really allowing, I think, encouraging those conversations that like each story and who you're trying to serve in each story is sometimes different, because some stories are about servicing the reader and providing information, and some stories about like, we want to lift up this one person because we want that person to be able to get the resources and help, or these people just want their story told. And so it's figuring out like which bucket this story is falling into. And
we are talking the world of powerless people, right?
Yes, absolutely.
If a mayor wants to,
yeah, we have that very clear.
No.
Yeah, we have very clear that our harm minimization guidelines are about people who lack power, and so elected officials, police, people in positions of power in the criminal legal system and in society. This is not for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm hearing so many threads of conversation on this stage that mirrors conversations, in the sessions. Like we had a session on language and saying what you mean and how language can signal in content. I was part of the DEI roundtables on how the struggles like investigative newsrooms are really thinking about the tensions between who their stories are about and who actually consumes and reads those stories. Like these things are really elevating, and a lot of you all in this room are like responsible for making these calls for your organization and for your staff. You might have heard of a little thing called Breaking the News, which is a documentary about the 19th that followed its inception. What I really loved about this documentary is that you all were pretty vulnerable in it. You talk about the struggles of making decisions around making sure your staff felt safe, your staff felt represented, and how the organization was operating, and how leadership and staff had really tough conversations to sort of reconcile that. But there's a piece in there that features you, Chabeli. Do you mind if we play it?
We're gonna watch it. I'm gonna close my eyes and disassociate for 2 minutes.
Okay. And then you'll tell us all about it.
You don't
All
want
right.
to watch 200 people watch you? Okay.
I know it's so awkward, but I'd like to share it. Okay, we can play the video, Oscar. Thank you.
So even though it's a very well-known touristy area, the families in need, it's a significant need.
The last big story I worked on before I came to the 19th was a story called Laborland that was about Disney workers. There was some back and forth about whether people wanted to read about poor people and about whether that was even our readership and whether we should focus more on the middle class or try to bring the middle class in. And yeah, sure, but that wasn't really what I wanted to write about. This problem does not stop being relevant because it cannot be relevant to someone in the middle class or the upper class. And I think part of the reason it continues to exist is because the middle class or the upper class don't find it relevant to them. I know Kelly was asking you about the pandemic. You all were working or not working?
Yeah.
Is your husband?
We were working at the flea market, and the flea market just shut down. I've told my husband several times I wish they would put like on food stamps, like a diaper allowance or something, on there just for even one pack.
When your income is just so low that you're struggling just to provide for your children, it's really hard to get that extra up to buy the amount of diapers and wipes you need.
The issue with poverty reporting sometimes is people just want to be like, look at how hard these people's lives are, but also like, look how hard they're working to try to get, to move ahead. And look how hard it is.
Like, am I even fit to be a mom? And then you have to think about it like, yeah, I love these kids. I can give them love. Just because I can't put diapers on them doesn't mean I'm not worthy of being their mother.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's an incredible documentary. I encourage you all to check it out. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the clip. And really, what I'm more curious about is, in a story like that, how does that connect to the work culture? Your relationship with your editor, or just how decisions are made, how you're sent on assignment like that. What about the 19th allows you to be in that position?
Painful always to watch the documentary, but I love that. I actually do love that scene because that's one of my favorite stories I've ever worked on. That was a story about a diaper bank in Missouri. This was filmed in 2021, I think. And it was a story about a diaper bank and the work that they do to essentially cover an enormous area in Missouri where they're literally driving to these little towns and taking donations of diapers to these families in need that do not have the money or access to be able to buy these products for their children. And it's a story that is a really sort of, we conceived of it as a really invisible part of poverty in America, something that a lot of people don't talk about. There's a lot of shame and stigma attached to it. And we crafted it as a solution story of how this diaper bank had become sort of a model for how to do rural diaper distribution. And it's obviously a story about gender, right? We had, there's all these studies that had come out about how moms that were not able to provide these products were really, really affecting their mental health and the way that they felt about who they were and how they were able to provide. So this is a story that, came together because the 19th focuses on what it focuses on. It's not a story that had been written about very much. We were looking for ways to talk about, so I'm an economy reporter, right? How does economy get me to diapers? And so at the 19th, they've really sort of encouraged me to think about my beat in sort of through this lens of gender and race, this intersectional lens. How do we apply that to economy reporting? And for us, that's writing about low-income people and all of the different ways that they face challenges and the structural systems that are working against them that are causing those challenges. And low-income folks are the vast majority are women of color and LGBTQ plus people and women. So that's really what we centered when we crafted and thought about the way that this beat would play out for us. And this story in Missouri in particular, I talked a little bit about my personal experience, and I used a lot of that in thinking about the questions that we were asking, how we were gonna talk to these folks. It was so important to me that we asked them beyond this worst moment in their life. We needed to know who they were as people, what happened before. Oftentimes, folks living in poverty, something went off track or a system didn't serve them, right? We needed to point out that WIC and SNAP, these federal programs that are supposed to help folks purchase items, do not cover diapers. And so now you have to have a diaper bank working with 3 volunteers to get these products out to folks because the system is not serving them. We needed to have all of that in the story. All of that needed to be part of the reporting. Those are conversations my editor and I had about what we were going to include. You see me in the clip ask her, what were you doing before? She was working. Her husband was working. They're trying to get out of this system that is working against them, and centering that in the story was really important for us. So that's one of my favorite clips from the documentary. And if you haven't seen them, I have been obligated to tell you this. There are some cards in the back tables with some QR codes if you want to see it. It's free to watch, free to stream.
Yeah, I was really excited about this panel because I feel like, there's a range and then there's a spectrum on how the work culture and newsrooms are evolving, and that we all are moving, we all are changing. And I think, Dean, you said this the other day, that I feel like, the industry is fragmented, right? The business model we know is an issue. And as a result, you have solely investigative news outlets, right? Enterprise, that the pace of work is different. You have people who are focused on solely community reporting, and the pace of that work is different. And you have the New York Times and you have the Washington Post. So with that, with the spectrum of thoughts and experiences on the panel, I would want to leave with you all sort of sharing one thing you feel like we should hold on to, something that's evolved that really needs to stick. And then one thing that you're even seeing now that you'd like to see us get rid of in the work culture. And as they're doing that, I invite folks to the microphones because we will take a few questions before we end. So Tara, let's start with you. What do we keep and what are we getting rid of?
I think we keep the move to talking more about our journalists' mental health and how we support them in the newsroom. I think one thing we can get rid of is treating the business side of a newsroom like a lockbox. Our journalists are inquisitive. They want to know, they're going to ask you tough questions. And so I think being more transparent is only going to help. Burnout doesn't just come from overwork. It also comes from a sense of powerlessness. And so journalists having a sense of where we are and a sense of stability, even if it's not that stable, just the knowledge is really, really helpful for trying to prevent burnout.
God, I think I'm going to steal your two. I agree that we should talk about journalists' mental health. We should be, the days when you just sort of it's a mission, deal with it. We should care about our people, their mental health, how they work. It's interesting, the business side thought. I think that the biggest revolution in journalism, not in the structure of journalism, is the diminishment of advertising and the rise of the reader, the rise of the power of the reader, right? And once that happened, even at the New York Times, frankly, the whole world of the business side changed. It just became something different. It wasn't They weren't people we had to keep a distance from because they were, they were selling ads. They were people who actually had the same goal as us, which is draw audience, right? So, I mean, in that revolution, the traditional relationship between the newsroom and the people who try to get your news stories read and delivered has changed. And I think that that's not something we should get rid of. That's something we should hold on to. And I think the days when journalists would say, I don't want to even talk about what the economics of my institution are, you better think about the economics, whether you're a 5-person not-for-profit or a 2,000 staff New York Times.
I'll try to pick 2 different ones.
No, you have to do
Those are
ours,
good. No,
yeah.
yours are good. Yours are good. I'd say I'd love to see that more organizations are offering parental leave. I had a baby in the summer of 2022, and I took 6 months of leave, and that was transformational time. I came out of that leave with the story ideas that would become the project that I've worked on since then. I thought of those while I was there, and I just felt so grateful for it. And I just felt like, wow, people deserve to have this. Why don't they? It made me a better worker. It made me more committed to my work, my newsroom. And we did this. We've had these policies from day one as a startup. So let's not diminish our own creativity, y'all. I feel like if we could do it, other folks can do it too. You just have to value it. You have to put it up there. And then on the flip side, I'd say pay secrecy. I think that only serves people who are already in positions of power. And I think we need to be a little bit more transparent about that if we want a culture that is sustainable and that is equitable.
Thank you. Okay, we will take questions. We've already got one. Please state your name and your organization.
Sure.
If you would, thanks.
Kirk Whistler, Empowering Latino Futures. Loved the documentary about the 19th. Felt it was one of the best documentaries on media I'd ever seen, and I've certainly seen a number of them over the years. And it really played up the whole evolution of media to where it is today, and showed the growth and importance of diversity within the organization. That was one of the key things that made it grow. My question isn't so much for the panel, but for the audience. How many here saw the documentary? That is sad, because really, those are the kind of things everybody should have been gravitating to one way or another, and should have been playing it up, and that right from the start, because that will help everybody grow.
I paid Kirk to say that. Thank you. Thank you, Kirk.
All right, we'll take one over here.
Hi, I'm Melanie. I work with Kirk, actually, who just spoke. I already felt overwhelmed. I feel inadequate after this conference. How do you, at a personal and emotional level, when I'm so overwhelmed, keep the passion? And, I really, sometimes I'm crying, and my stuff's not even stories like that. It's not that emotional, I guess. How do I keep that, especially when I don't really have reporters and I'm trying to do everything on my own? And sometimes you're just like, you know what, I can't. And after listening to everything at this conference, I really can. I feel like that even more. How do I overcome that? Or tips, or from an audience even? What do you think?
Well, first you should first off, I think it's courageous and open to talk about that. I think that the first thing you have to do is accept the fact you can't do everything, and then not do everything. I know that seems like obvious advice, but whenever, and we all feel overwhelmed in different moments of our careers. Whenever I have felt overwhelmed, which has been a lot, I sort of have to own up to the fact that I can't do all the things. And I also can't do them all equally well. And I should really think hard about the couple of things that I can do really well and that give me joy. And I can't get away with only doing that, and maybe I have to throw something else in the mix. But you just gotta be pretty ruthless in figuring out what can I actually do and what can't I do. And give up the stuff that you can't do.
And I acknowledge that I think many people share that sentiment. We hear from members burnout, loneliness. There was a session on saving lives and finding joy that was a story, a session on how news leaders are building like mutual support groups because the work is very hard. And matter of fact, when we were thinking about, we were like, it's got to be somewhere that's like Iron Days has to be somewhere that's relaxing. Like it needs to be a treat for people because your time is valuable and you all work very hard. So I just want to acknowledge that many people feel that way. And so thank you for sharing and bringing that question.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll take a question here.
Hi, I'm Sam Mintz with Brookline.News. We're a hyperlocal startup right outside Boston. Sort of a similar question, which is about when you're a tiny startup, brand new newsroom. We currently have 1.5 people in our newsroom and one business person. How do you think about instilling the kind of culture that you're talking about? A lot of you have sort of institutional people, larger teams who are sort of tasked with thinking strategically and internally. We don't have any of that. We have me and a couple other people. So how did you start, if and when you were smaller, sort of thinking about culture in those ways?
Tara, do you mind taking that question?
Yeah, we started from the very beginning. We're 7 people, and we probably didn't have to write it all down, but it really mattered to us to write these things down from the very beginning. And so we actually did sprint days for the first year or so. And so once every kind of month on a Wednesday, we would all set aside a couple of hours to work over Zoom and work on some of these bigger strategy questions. And so we didn't always come up with answers. Sometimes the first one would be, compensation. Thoughts? And we had, there was an article coming out in Reynolds Journalism Institute in a couple of weeks about how we created our equitable and transparent salaries. But those honestly were the sorts of conversations would start with like, what are our questions? And then one person would be tasked with going away, particularly at that size, to researching and coming back with ideas. It's really just like breaking it down and then talking about those and getting kind of like consensus. So particularly at that size, we're worker-led, and I think you could do it at that size with a couple of people. And then deciding on, okay, like someone draft up something, and then are we good to move ahead with this? And I think like doing it from the very beginning, as early as you can, is really, really helpful because you're creating that foundation of culture for when I'm sure you will grow. And you have it also, having things in writing is really helpful for when somebody forgets. And then you can point it back to like, this is our standards of how we work. And so I just encourage you to like decide, kind of to Dean's point though, decide which things are really important. Pick 2 or 3 things that you want to work on over the next year and focus in on those and just break it down step by step. And definitely don't think you have to like walk away from this and start applying all of it straight away. You want to really think about how it works and ties into the values of your newsroom during that process.
All right.
Hi, my name is Beena Sarwar. I run Sapan News. I came in here from Boston, and I'm from Pakistan. And I love what you said about your parental leave at the 19th, because you wouldn't expect in Pakistan for a newsroom to get. I got 4 months maternity leave, and when I went back to office, I often would take my baby with me, and I would breastfeed her in the office, and that's not something that
Awesome.
is and it said that, and nobody batted an eye, and you don't expect that in Pakistan, but that's not the kind of stuff that makes the news, I wasn't going to write about it.
That's a great point.
But I think this is such an important panel, and I think that for all of us here, like you said, people are engaged in all kinds of difficult writing, reporting, writing, and stuff like that. And I remember, sorry, this is not a question, I just thought of this because of what the person before me said. And I remember when I was, there was a woman who had been burnt really badly by her in-laws. There was this stove blast deaths in Pakistan where people would, anyway, she was in hospital really badly burnt, and I was helping a Dutch journalist to film her story. And I came out of there like so traumatized, and I'm like, what are we doing? You know, we are exploiting this person who's in so much pain, and what are we doing? And she said something to me that might be useful for people to hear, so I'll just share that. She said that, you know, and it speaks to what all of you have said, that we have to do our job. And if we don't tell these stories, who will? And if we tell the story of this woman who's so badly burnt, maybe it will help enact more laws, or maybe it'll help someone to help the hospital to donate and stuff. So our work does trigger and catalyze these kind of things. So I guess those weren't really questions as such, but I just wanted to, you know, and I really appreciate this emphasis on the culture of transparency and inclusiveness, and you know.
And I think that's such a good point, right? Because sometimes people really want to tell their stories, even if you're worried, you know, this might cause harm or whatever. You're giving them the platform, and it's your job to be transparent about that with them, about this is what's going to be in there, or, you know, not exact detail, or however it is that your newsroom does it, but transparent about them, about this is the process, this is what people are going to read. If you still want to tell your story, let's do it, right? We can empower folks to do that as well, even when it's a hard story. So I think that's a really great point as well.
When I was a reporter in New Orleans, I went with the 19-year-old police reporter. I went with the older police reporter, who was probably 25, to knock on this door of someone whose child had been murdered, like a teenager. And boy, I did not want to do this. This was that era when you didn't say no. So I went with the police reporter, who's the most empathetic journalist I've ever worked with to this day. Knocked on the door. The brother of the victim opened the door, and I thought was going to deck us. And I'm telling the older guy, let's go, let's go. The mother shouted from the back of the room, let him in. And she wanted to, you know, this was her one chance to tell the story of the life of her kid, and she wanted to do it, right? So to your point.
We have time for one more question, but we're going to do two, and here's how we're going to do it. You're going to state your question, and then you'll state your question, and then we'll answer those two and close. Okay.
It's like that game you described.
Hi, I'm Natasha Yee with the Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting. So Chabeli, I was also impressed by your story of parental leave. I was with an organization, I was pregnant, and when I announced to them, I was part-time, so I knew I wasn't covered by FMLA, but they basically told me, even though I had a great relationship with my editors, once you leave your position, it will be terminated. So I see that with these startups, there's this focus on changing things and having these great policies, but for maybe traditional news organizations or organizations that don't have these policies in place, how do you shift that culture?
Okay, and yours?
You know, it's basically the same question, because what I was going to say is that, you know, in this panel, you're talking about the newsroom today being more evolved. And I actually don't think that's the case. Like, places that used to be more evolved with financial pressure are becoming less so. You know, by the way, I run a nonprofit newsroom in Los Angeles, capital in Maine. You know, the LA Times, for instance, just had a big round of layoffs, and they're telling staff there's going to be a new round of like productivity measures. And already for the past couple of years, reporters were evaluated somehow on what they call the conversion rate. Somebody came up with a metric on how many people subscribe to the paper after reading a story. So there are all kinds of things like that are happening now. And, you know, just real pay is lower in most places. And the industry, so here's where I'm going. The industry sets a low standard. We pay $800 for a freelance story, which is pretty high by the industry. I think it's more than what the LA Times pays. But if you think about the number of hours, you know, it takes a journalist to do that story, we're not sure if it's a living wage or not. So we're struggling to come up with standards. So we have editorial standards that get codified in an AP style book, or, you know, an SPJ or something like that are sort of acknowledged of what it takes to do good journalism on that end. But other than individual organizations, like what you're talking about, kind of figuring things out on their own, or having maybe a labor dispute that resolves something, it's basically saying, what more can we do to kind of universalize the notion that journalists need to be able to do good journalism, kind of a certain protection of their standard of living and security. You know, it's sort of like if you live in a country where police officers are poorly paid, you know, how that leads to corruption. And we've seen that before in journalism where people take money and do things like that. So, I'm not exactly sure what the question is.
I think the question is what can be done?
Yeah.
And if you could speak to maybe something pretty practical.
Can I say one thing? No, I do actually think the traditional, I do think the traditional news organizations have changed, at least from, the New York Times certainly has. I agree we're not under the same kind of economic pressures that others are. But I do think they're very different places. I'm not pretending that everybody's fully evolved, but they're different. On coming up with standards, look, journalists came up with standards that are now baked into us about journalism. All three of us, even though we have very different news organizations, our general body of if you shrunk it to 4 or 5 standards, they're all, we all follow the same. We're maybe journalists in some regions should get together and say what should the standards be? And that's a separate issue, by the way, from union or guild issues. That's because those have to be negotiated. I just mean what should the life of a journalist in California be like? And the beauty of the current moment, by the way, unlike the moment I grew up in, where we would never have talked to each other, we were trying to beat each other every day on stories, is you all talk to each other. And maybe you should talk to each other and think about what those standards could look like.
Thank you. On that note, I agree. I would like to thank you all. This is a really interesting conversation. I wasn't sure where it was going to go, but I'm
Thank you.
really happy with it.